please mute.
And I will be muting everyone as we start our program. So welcome again for our third and final session of the discussion about Jewish views of the afterlife, what happens after I die. And the focus tonight will be on communication between worlds, near-death experiences, and Jewish mourning practices. And actually, I'm going to begin with the Jewish mourning practices. And then I have some stories, some of them, which I have told you just from my own life about, well, not near-death experiences, but communication between worlds. And then one of the things I started doing was rereading some of the books that I've gotten much of this material about, and I've come to the appalling realization that I now need to reread them all. And you can see them behind me. And I mean, because there's so much I don't remember from these books, which they're very, very important. At least they're important and very interesting to me. So let's begin. And once again, a word from my sponsor, the Jewish Federation of Ventura County, and my particular role as community rabbi made possible by the Affordable Living Choices Trust, managed by Joel and Barbara Aronson, for whom I am grateful, to whom I am grateful. And as always, you know, I have a website, latker.com, and I've posted in connection with this class. If you go to the website, this is what you see. Click on classes, and you can get copies of the slides. I've been doing a lot of editing, so I need to repost those. A Moment article, which I find a nice summary of the different movements, viewpoints about the afterlife. And then we'll have, beginning either late tonight or tomorrow, we'll have videos of all three of the sessions. And it is very nice. I mean, we have now, let's say, almost 50 people. I have had many people tell me that they're watching on, that they are watching on by video. So I'm glad that is working out well. So again, the first subject is Jewish mourning practices. And there is a quote, and I think it's Rabbi Schulweis, Harold Schulweis of blessed memory, who coined the phrase that Jews get very focused on the details of Jewish law when they are hatched, matched, and dispatched, namely rituals of birth, rituals of weddings, and rituals of funerals. And I actually think it's even more of an issue at funerals than it is in the other places. I often reflect that when my mother died, my father, who wasn't the slightest bit observant, I think some of you know I never went to a high holiday service in my life until my mid-30s. So we didn't go as a family. I didn't go at all. He wasn't the slightest bit observant. The only thing we would do in the course of a year was have a Passover Seder. When my mother died, he absolutely wanted to obey every last possible element of Jewish law. And of course, this was his way of honoring my mother. There is, so one of the things, I don't think I have this on any of the slides. One of the things that I've often mentioned to people who are wondering what to do concerning a funeral, specifically people who are not Orthodox or not very observant, but yet they still are struggling with, well, and you'll see, should we get a shomer? Should we have a plain box? Are we allowed to have flowers? There's a lot of questions that arise. There's a lot of law on the subject of what one does under Jewish law. And so I always encourage them to ask two questions. Once you've left the world of Jewish law, if you're in the world of Jewish law and you want to be observant, then I don't know, maybe there's 200 questions. I'm not sure. I haven't tried to count them. But if you've left the rigors of halacha, what I often comment on are two questions. Question number one, how do I honor the person who has passed away? Question number two, how do I comfort people who love the person who has passed away? And then as you're making all of these decisions, to be guided by those two questions. So in the process of mourning, there are several phases. And the first one is aninut, which is the phase from the time that the person has died until the funeral. And by the way, these laws under Jewish law apply not to everyone. They apply to specific relatives of the deceased. So as I often say, God forbid, the parents of the deceased, the spouse of the deceased, the siblings of the deceased, and the children of the deceased. That's under Jewish law, that's who are obligated to obey these laws. So during this period of time from death until the funeral, the mourner is called an onen, and the focus is on honoring the deceased. Since the body is regarded as a creation of God and a dwelling place of the soul, we've talked about this quite a bit in the last two classes, the body itself has sacred status. So there is a focus on caring for the body. And some of you may know, I can't remember what I have on the slides. There is a ritual called tahara, which is a ritual cleansing of the body. And there is, in Jewish tradition, you are supposed to bury someone within 24 hours of their passing. And that is, certainly you don't have a burial on Shabbat or on a holiday. And under Jewish law, you're allowed to delay the burial in order to honor the person who has passed away. So you can delay it for a day or two or so for people to arrive. In practice, in the Orthodox world with which I am familiar, there's a great emphasis on very rapid burial. And the people who are onens are exempt from other time-bound Jewish laws. So for example, if your parent has died, and in Orthodoxy, and you're a male and you're obligated to pray 3 times a day, you're exempted from that rule. So when people often will come to me and say, I'm completely out of it, I don't know which way is up, my comment is always, that's exactly where you're supposed to be in terms of Jewish tradition. You're not supposed to be functioning so well. In fact, you're even exempt in Jewish law from daily prayer. So again, from the death to the funeral, the closest, I do have this, closest relatives are exempt from the positive mitzvot, quick burial within a day of possible. And that's why flowers never became traditional in Judaism. The reason for flowers in other cultures is to hide the smell of decomposition. So if you're going to wait a week for the funeral, and grandpa's in the living room, that's going to be an olfactory issue, to put it gently. And so you surround the casket with flowers. That never became a tradition in Judaism, but in answer to lots of questions people ask me, there is nothing wrong with having flowers. It's just, it's not a time-honored Jewish tradition. It's much more common, as many of you will know, to make an announcement along the lines of, in lieu of flowers, the family requests a donation, and then people will often list a charity that is especially important to the family. So visitors don't visit before the funeral. You're actually not supposed to drop by the house of mourning, because the presumption is, again, that the family is too busy getting things together, getting ready for the funeral. So it is not traditional to visit either the funeral home or the family before the funeral. The body is traditionally not left unattended. There is someone called a shomer. Shomer literally means one who guards, and traditionally the body is never left alone. In ancient times, there was a very practical reason for this, namely to prevent the body from being attacked by vermin, by bugs, by mice.
You got muted, Rabbi.
You're muted.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Cheryl. So I don't know where I was muted. Body not left unattended because there is
about 10 seconds ago, a rat, mice and bugs.
Okay, yes. So that's the reason. So when people ask me, should we have a shomer? The story of my being a rabbi is always about explaining the origins of rituals and then letting people make their own decisions. So I explain the origin, and some of these things are not inexpensive these days, particularly if the burial is going to be 4 or 5 days later, which is not so unusual. You're going to hire a shomer who is literally sitting outside the refrigeration storage area at the cemetery or the mortuary, I guess, to be more precise. And I've never met a female shomer, is just reading Psalms the whole time. So it's not inexpensive.
Okay,
So I always just will explain
I do.
the origin of the shomer, and then people can make their own decisions. Somebody asked about autopsy. Generally speaking, you are not supposed to treat the body disrespectfully. So an autopsy, unless it's required by law, would not be permitted. Since I'm not Orthodox, I don't get into these fights. I know it can be a big issue, but there is a general principle in Jewish law, which in its Aramaic statement is dina malchuta dina, which means the law of the land is the law. So you're required to obey the local law. I know that that it can be a point of contention, and certainly embalming is not traditional. You're supposed to bury the body with all of its parts, including blood. And if a soldier is killed in battle, there's an attempt to get the blood that has even spilled into the earth and bury that with the person. Bryce.
Quick question, which has a higher morality, achieving justice or avoiding an autopsy? The reason I mention that is that my mother had been poisoned by a pharmaceutical error, and we had to hire a private autopsy to be able to gather evidence.
So I don't know that. I just plain don't know in terms of pursuing a suit or police actions. The only thing I would say is, having worked as a fire chaplain, basically 99% of my role as a fire chaplain is someone dies and I'm called to the home of the person who has died. Unless that person is in a hospital or on hospice, the medical examiner in Ventura County has to approve that a mortuary can come and pick up the body. So until the medical examiner signs off, the body can't be removed from the house. And indeed, the medical examiner, the police will typically get on the phone with the medical examiner, and it's not so unusual that if the medical examiner has some questions, that no one will be allowed to go into the room where the deceased is, other than police and firemen, firefighters, and sometimes if they want something like a blanket or a robe in the room, I will go in and get that. So the main thing is that the law of the land is the law. So I'm going to call on Richard and then whoever just said Rabbi.
I did.
Okay, just a second.
Thank you, Rabbi. I typed this in the chat, but I thought I would just speak the question. Are you aware of any cultures or traditions that sort of just treat death in sort of a matter-of-fact kind of way without a lot of ritual and, okay, it happened, we're just going to, it's part of life and we're just going to go on with it. Do all cultures sort of make a big... So
I'm not a sociologist. There may well be people in this room that know more about it, but I don't know any cultures that don't regard death as something significant. The attitude toward death, is actually can be quite different in different cultures. I've attended some fundamentalist Christian funerals where there was a joyous attitude, and it wasn't only joyous because the person lived to be a ripe old age and we're celebrating their life. We certainly do that in Judaism as well, but joyous because now the person is going on to a better world and we should be happy for that person. So I would say there are lots of different attitudes about people passing, but I'm not aware of any culture that sort of doesn't treat it as being very significant. Miriam, you had something.
Yes, I had a question about organ donors. When
Okay.
does that? Okay.
Okay. So the issue with organ donation is, in most cases, the purpose for organ donation is to save someone's life or preserve their health. So I would say almost all of the Jewish movements will enthusiastically endorse the idea of organ donation. There are sometimes in the ultra-Orthodox world that can be an issue with, let's say, donating a cornea, because if you're donating a cornea to someone, you're not actually saving their life, you might be saving their vision. So again, most movements would enthusiastically endorse that idea, but not necessarily all. And then if you're donating your body for medical research, again, I would say certainly the Reform movement, the conservative movement would endorse that as a way of improving healthcare and science in general, but not all the movements would necessarily endorse that.
Thank you. That's good.
Okay, and Suzanne is saying that in New Haven, the Jewish funeral homes automatically had shomers, and you were not asked if you want it. My family was happy, yeah. So I'm not familiar with that process of it being automatic. And in fact, if someone wants to have a shomer, at a local cemetery, that's something that we have to arrange. I'm happy to help them arrange that. I actually have a funeral tomorrow, and I have another funeral on Friday. Okay, so the practice of funerals is to keep it simple. And the reason for that is that during Talmudic times, the rich folks were getting much fancier funerals than the poor folks. And that, of course, was insulting or humiliating to the poor folks. So the rabbis instituted a general principle that everyone's funeral should be simple. Before I dig into the details, I see Murray, you have your hand up.
Hi. How far back in time do these rituals go? Back to Moses or back to Abraham?
Well, in the Bible in Genesis, it talks about Abraham buying a place to bury his wife. So clearly a special place to bury loved ones goes back to the book of Genesis. And then we also have Jacob erecting a pillar, a matzevah. So the idea of a stone being erected over someone's grave goes back to Genesis. I would say the detailed rituals would be Talmudic.
So that would include the autopsies and embalming. I mean, Joseph was embalmed.
Yes, yeah. There is no reference to prohibition. It's a very good question. There's no reference to prohibitions against embalming that I'm aware of in the Bible. There may be in some of the other books, certainly not in Torah. So I would say these rules, like almost all of the Judaism that we practice, I say over and over again, our religion is not the religion of the Hebrew Bible. Our religion is the religion of the Talmud. So the details of how we practice our religion certainly is Talmudic, and the Talmud is about 1,500 years old, roughly.
So it's just the one about the tattoos that you're not.
So tattoos is mutilating your body. There's actually prohibitions in the Torah against mutilating your body, because it was a form of idol worship, to make slashes, to basically damage the body. So there is a prohibition against any mutilation of your body, including tattoos, including piercings, except since earrings are mentioned in the Bible, it is even in very traditional world, women are permitted to have earrings. And I'm sorry.
And no mutilations except for circumcision.
Circumcision is considered a tikkun, a repair, not a mutilation. But it is not true. It's not true what you've heard from your mother or grandmother, that you can't be buried in a Jewish synagogue if you have a tattoo. This was a tool used by Jewish parents to try and keep your kids against getting tattoos. Judith Shapiro asked about protecting, does the shomer guard against dibuks? I can't remember the exact language, but guarding the body against other spirits, I think, is also one of the reasons behind the shomer. So I'll tell the story. I actually have the details in one of the slides of the Reichman brothers story. So part of the simplicity of a funeral is you're buried in a simple shroud. And again, rather than being buried in very fancy clothing, which was valuable and also, a bit showy, you're buried in a very simple shroud, and the shroud doesn't have any pockets because you're not allowed to take anything with you. And that actually leads to, well, for one thing, again, when I'm advising people, one of the ironies is sometimes I describe that process as being perfectly perverse, because the reason for the shroud was to make less of a financial impact on someone rather than burying them in clothing, which was valuable. And of course, today, typically when someone dies, they have lots of clothing, and the funeral home, the mortuary, will try and sell them a shroud, which is, I think, several $100s. But the reason is for simplicity. I'll tell the Reichman story a little bit later. Somebody says, when my grandmother died during Sukkot, she had to have a special shroud on. I'm not familiar with that. Could be.
Rabbi, I have two questions.
Okay.
Really quick. What does it mean? No metal, war inconsistent with rest and peace. What does that mean?
So the coffin is traditionally made with wood and wood only. No metal, meaning the coffin's not made of metal. There are no metal handles, and it's even not put together with nails. So because the idea of metal is used in swords, and you want the person to rest in peace, so you don't use anything in the coffin made with any metal. Viewing is discouraged except for making an identification. My understanding is that under Jewish law and under California law, someone has to positively identify the person before they are buried. But having an open casket is inconsistent with Judaism. And here I'm just blown away. And I'm curious about my East Coast buddies now. When I grew up, there were Jewish funeral homes. And, when my grandparents died, when my uncle died, they had a viewing the night before. We would go there, the casket would be open. This is at a Jewish funeral home. And of course, I was kind of weirded out by it, but I never knew that it was inconsistent with Jewish law. But it is, and I am very flexible on many, many, many things, but I will not be present in the room with an open casket. So I would say these days in funerals I conduct, it's not unusual for families to want to have an open casket so people can say goodbye, but the casket is always closed when the service begins and not opened again. Harriet, hold on a second, Mary. Harriet.
When my father-in-law passed away in Brooklyn many years ago, the night before the funeral, at the funeral home, they ushered us into a room where the coffin was, and he was sitting up propped up, and it looked like he was still alive.
Where was this and how long ago?
In Brooklyn. This was back in 1960.
Okay, so that's my memory, and I just plain don't understand it.
Yeah, scary.
So someone is asking, is a hip replacement considered a mutilation? No, because it has health effects. So, it's done for health. So anything you do for health, if you have a diseased arm, you must cut it off in order to preserve your health. So anything that's done in this, in the name of preserving health would not be considered mutilation. So I am going to go basically to people that haven't asked questions yet. So Marilyn, Barbara, and then Murray. Nope.
When my mother died, I was very pregnant and had been up for something like 36 hours. So I didn't have that viewing in New York. The coffin was closed, but it was traditional to have people visit the funeral home. And people were angry at me for doing that. And I just said, I have to take care of myself. I'm exhausted.
Yeah, I just plain don't understand it. And also, even visiting someone before the funeral is not traditional. So when I say I don't understand it, I don't understand it on a lot of levels. Barbara.
Yes, so is cremation recognized in Judaism?
Yeah, so I can't remember when I talk about cremation, but
Okay.
let me get through some questions, and then Murray.
Thanks. When I was 11, I went to my first funeral, my grandma, and they had the viewing that night, the day before the official service. And when I got there, my father asked me if I wanted to see it, and I was like, all right. And when I got to my grandmother, my cousin Erica had already put on some makeup on her and even sprayed her with some perfume called Sierra. So till this day, if I ever smell that, it reminds me of that. So I was not able to see her as is. She actually looked, normal, except for I touched her face and it was like cold and not
so
pliable.
So Murray,
after, just to finish it, when I saw my uncle years later, when I was an adult, they had actually the viewing during the service in the morning, which kind of surprised me. I got there late because I was coming down from Binghamton, and they had shaved his beard but left the mustache.
Murray, let's not get into all the details. It happens a lot. It is not traditional. I don't know why Jewish funeral homes do this.
Well, that's what I'm saying is I feel like it's better to have the closed casket. So you remember how they were, not how they are.
That's an issue I'm not even going to address, because some people want to see the person. And again, on my rules, once you're not following Jewish law, if you feel like you're honoring the person by doing that and you're comforting people who love the person, then I don't have a problem with it, except I won't be in the same room.
Is there not a tradition though from Ishmael and Isaac about like enemies coming together for the father?
No. I don't know. But nobody was dead there, so I don't think there's a biblical precedent. Jane.
I know that when my brother died suddenly, and we had to wait for the body to be shipped, and this is going back to 1980, and I know that he didn't care much as far as following any ritual and stuff, but in the funeral home in New York City, we were allowed to go in and to view the body. And I felt that it was, for me, it was almost to prove that he really you know,
So
was dead.
all right, let me, there are a couple of people that are asking that I move on. So there's a lot of different examples, and I really don't want to comment on them. What I want to say is two things. If you're asking about Jewish law, the answer is it's not traditional. If you're asking about what is okay once you've left Jewish law, I would say the issue for me is honoring the deceased and comforting mourners. And what surprises me was that now maybe the funeral homes just asked, do you want to do this? And
Well,
my
we
guess
were
is,
the immediate family. I mean, it was
yeah, no, okay,
my
I
father,
understand.
my mother.
I understand. It does, but it's not consistent with Jewish law. I mean,
Okay.
Jewish law, one person makes an identification. Suzanne.
In New Haven, the tradition is for the family to be out in the temple, but outside the sanctuary about an hour to 45 minutes before the funeral, and people come and greet them. And when I came out here and they weren't doing it, it surprised me, but I think the different customs in different communities.
Yeah, I don't know in terms of greeting. What's going on here, I do know, and that is the mortuary, the cemetery wants to keep things moving along, and if people are schmoozing and chatting, things are going to be greatly delayed, and it's a natural instinct to greet people. So, okay, so let me move on, and we will take more questions at the end. It's traditional to place earth in the grave, and again with this idea of resurrection in the time of the coming of the Messiah. The physical resurrection is, there's discussions of people tunneling to Jerusalem. So I think a little bit of earth from Jerusalem, I always think of it, I'm sure this is not the tradition, kind of like a bloodhound. So you know what you're supposed to be looking for. And of course, the best place to be buried would be at the Mount of Olives. There's an enormous cemetery on the hill, you know, just above the old city, east of the old city. Okay, at the funeral, it is traditional for the obligated mourners to tear their garments, and it's called kriya, and it's that you see, I think biblically, people tearing their garments in grief. There's even, you know, even on Tisha B'Av when you're in mourning, it is, particularly if you visit the Western Wall because you're mourning the destruction of the temple, you tear your garments. What is very common, and I'll have a picture of it, is for people that don't want to tear their garments, is there will be a black ribbon that you tear. And the tradition is that the children of the deceased tear the garment on the left side over their heart, and all of the other obligated mourners would have the ribbon or tear the garments on the right side. And the idea is you may have, you know, lots of brothers, you can even have lots of wives, you can have lots of children, but you only have one father and one mother. So that's a unique issue of tearing on the left side. Again, I will often be asked at funerals, can grandchildren wear a ribbon? Sometimes if the mortuary just puts out ribbon, people who don't know, everyone takes one. And you're not obligated to, but there is nothing, you know, I don't have a problem personally with anyone who wants to have a ribbon and tearing the ribbon to do so. Okay, yeah, there's a quote, I forgot I had it in there, that Jacob tears his garments when he sees the coat that he thinks is Joseph, is evidence of Joseph's death. The blessing that we say upon tearing the ribbon is Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, dayan ha'emet, which is blessed are you Adonai, our God, ruler of everything, the true judge. So the thing I say at every funeral is people will often ask me, how is it that we can declare God a true judge at these difficult times? And one answer is, when it might be so difficult to do so spontaneously, our tradition fortifies our spiritual backbone by requiring us to declare God the true judge.
What about step parents?
I actually don't know what the law is, so
okay.
I just plain don't know.
Okay.
It's also very traditional to help bury the deceased. So again, in the Orthodox world, Jews are supposed to bury Jews. So in practice, what that means is even sometimes when the cemetery attendant is winding a crank to lower the body into the grave, someone will put their hand on their shoulder, and then Jews will fill in earth into the grave. And again, I would say in my world, that's 95% of the time symbolic, that people will put either one shovelful, or there's a tradition of 3 shovelfuls of earth in the grave. There's a tradition of using the backside of the shovel. It's actually a Sephardic tradition to show that your world is turned upside down. And slightly more observant would be having people attending the funeral put enough earth in the grave to cover the casket. And then more traditional would be completely filling the grave. And it takes some time. And someone asked, do mortuaries keep a supply of Israeli earth? Yes, you can. I think I even have a picture of one. You can buy little packets, or they buy little packets, and they have a big supply. So there is a tradition. I'll talk about the Kaddish in a little bit. The Kaddish is one of the prayers that require a minyan. The word minyan means a quorum, traditionally 10 people who are obligated to pray. And this arises because certain prayers, including the Mourners Kaddish, require a congregational response. I'll point it out actually when I show you the Kaddish. So since the prayer requires a congregational response, the rabbis are going to have to address the question of how many people constitute a congregation. And there's at least 2 precedents in the Bible for making that number 10. So in a traditional burial, you would not have a Kaddish unless there were 10 adult men there. I would say in the conservative and reform movement and other liberal movements, men and women who are above the age of majority are counted in a minyan. And then there's a whole other thing. I can't remember if we discussed this. I discuss it so often in so many different contexts. But if you are a Kohen, so who is a Kohen? The word Kohen or Kohen means priest. I think as you may know, I hope you know, in biblical times, there were Jewish priests. And the role of the Jewish priest was to officiate at the sacrificial service. And the priest, I like to think of the priesthood and the sacrificial service as being kind of like an antenna. God and Israel communicate in biblical times through the office of the priests and sacrifice of animals and grains and liquids at the temple in Jerusalem. You don't want to do anything to disturb that. If you remember the old days of rabbit ears, you wouldn't mess with the rabbit ears once you got it right. Okay. So the rule is there are there are several requirements that apply only to priests. And one of them is they are not allowed to have contact with death. That makes them ritually impure and renders them incapable of offering sacrifices. So traditionally, the Kohanim don't attend funerals. Well, let me make it more precise. They won't enter a cemetery. What do we mean by entering a cemetery? It's a number, 3 cubits, 4 cubits, cubits 1.5 feet from the edge of where the graves are. So if you go to a traditional Orthodox synagogue, on the outer perimeter of the synagogue, you will see graves with hands like this. These are the hands used for the priestly benediction. So the priests, families of priests, are buried on the outer edge of the cemetery. So people who want to come and visit their loved one, if you're a priest, you don't actually have to enter the synagogue.
The cemetery.
The cemetery, yeah, thank you. Yeah, my brain isn't quite connected to the rest of the parts. And in the Reform world, which of course I represent, I would say all issues relating to Kohanut, to priestly traditions, are not followed. And in other worlds, people follow them more or less. But I've had, some very interesting things where I've officiated at a funeral and somebody said they're a Kohen, and so they're going to sit in the back of the room at the chapel. It didn't make any sense at all. In Israel, if you're really Orthodox, or I should say, if you're really Orthodox, there's issues you cannot even be on a plane with a body. So normally bodies are flown all the time around, and they're in cargo. And so, if it's El Al, they are going to somehow check to make sure that that's not an issue for the Kohanim, because being in a plane with a body, you're in an enclosed area, which means you're in an enclosed space. So that's not allowed. So I'm going to look at some of the questions. Why are books buried in the grave with a coffin? So books, I don't know if they're actually buried in the grave with a coffin, but any books that contain one of the 7 names of God, or 7 words meaning God, you are not allowed to erase them or trash them. So there's 2 options. One is they are treated like a person, namely they're buried in a Jewish cemetery. Or number 2, they are put in a storeroom and just allowed to turn to dust. The storeroom is called the Geniza. But I think I've never officiated a funeral where people actually buried books with the person. I probably ought to put that in my will. I have no problem. I want to take my books with me. As you'll see, that's not a Jewish tradition of taking things with you. And the reason for that is, I think somebody asked about, I see this all the time. People want to be buried with pictures of the grandkids. People want to be buried with golf balls. People want to be buried with all kinds of interesting things. That is not Jewish tradition. And the reason it's not is because it definitely was Egyptian tradition, and other pagan religions have that tradition. And a lot of the restrictions in Judaism are really reactions against pagan traditions. Jane, hopefully quick.
Yeah. Years ago, maybe 45 years ago, my husband's aunt passed away, and I was pregnant with my son, and I was told not to go to the funeral. I couldn't go to the service. Is that?
Never heard of it.
I shouldn't.
Never heard of it. And just other questions, about that I'm seeing. If a Christian attends a Jewish funeral, should they participate in helping to bury the deceased? It's a great question. It never even occurred to me that in an Orthodox tradition that might be not okay. And I really don't have any idea whether that is the case. I certainly would never occur to me to ask whether someone is Jewish when they kind of line up. People ask, I've heard about putting shards, pottery shards in someone's eyes. I've heard about it. Books buried, yes. Okay, so let me move on. Okay, Mourners Kaddish is a really interesting, technically it's not a prayer. So let me actually read the translation. Exalted and hallowed be God's great name in the world which God created according to plan. May God's majesty be revealed in our days of our lifetime and in the life of all Israel, speedily, imminently, and we say amen. And then the whole congregation says, blessed is God's name, great name for all eternity. Blessed, praised, honored, exalted, extolled, glorified, adored, and lauded be the name of the Holy Blessed One beyond all earthly words and songs of blessing, praise, and comfort, to which we say amen. May there be abundant peace from heaven and life for us, for all Israel, to which we say amen. May the one who creates harmony on high bring peace to us and all Israel, to which we say amen. So, as I always point out, every funeral, that there is nothing about death or dying or sadness. This is a poem of praising God. So the question is, why are we praising God at these difficult times? And the answer, I always give 3 answers. One is when it's difficult to do so spontaneously. And of course, there's a big difference between burying, 98-year-old Zayda and burying a 16-year-old kid. So when it would be very difficult to praise God, our tradition requires us to do so. There's also an element of requiring a minyan. So if we didn't require a minyan for this prayer, you could say it, in the privacy of your bedroom when you really don't feel like getting out of bed and going to see anyone. But in fact, the fact that you need to do this with your congregation means you're going to have to get up and get together with your congregation. There's also the mystics believed, and this has to do again with the journey of the soul from this world to the next. And I hope I talked about this, but I can't quite frankly remember. But the journey of the soul from this world to the next world is considered to be assisted by people praising God in the name of the departed. And then the answer that I like best is, I think, a modern observation, but it speaks to what I believe is the central teaching of Judaism, which is God could have made a perfect world. God could have made a world with no death, with no war, with no disease, with no hunger, with no poverty, with no problems at all. But if we lived in such a world, we would literally have nothing to do. We would be decorations in God's garden, like the trees, the flowers. We might be beautiful, but no ethical significance. But the Torah teaches us that we are created in the image of God. Therefore, we must have serious ethical, creative work to do to serve God's.
You're muted.
You're muted.
Pointing it out. So as I always say, as wonderful as the next world may be, as the heavens may be, it's only in this world that Grandpa could do God's work of making the world a more loving, beautiful, friendly, happy place. And therefore, it's not only we, Grandpa's friends and family, who need comforting and consolation, but God too needs comforting and consolation. And then the other interesting thing about the Kaddish, which many of you know, is that it may look like Hebrew and it may sound like Hebrew, but except for this very last line, Oseh Shalom Bimromav, it is in Aramaic, which is the language of the rabbis of the Talmud. And presumably they wrote it in Aramaic because they wanted us to be sure we understood what we were saying. And for those of you who are really into language, one of the markers of Aramaic is final alepphs. So if you look carefully, you have Yitgadal v'Yitgadash Shemei Rabbah. Rabbah is spelled with a final aleph. It means great, God's great name. God's great name in Hebrew would be Shem Rav. Alma is the Aramaic for Olam. Again, the aleph at the very end. I actually muted everyone, and maybe I muted myself in the process. Okay, let me move on. So here's just some symbols that you will know or recognize. One is a Yortzeit candle, which is a candle that's lit, that burns for 24 hours, and it's lit on the anniversary of someone's passing. And one of the things I always prepare, and again, typically the mortuary will do this, is a Yortzeit calendar for folks if they want to observe the Yortzeit on the Hebrew anniversary of the person's passing. This is a candle, a Shivah candle, which burns for 7 days, because the most intense period of mourning, I think I have slides on this, is the first 7 days. So typically when you go home back to the house of mourning, you light the Shivah candle. You probably know there is a tradition of putting stones on the grave, and that is typically, it really has no more significance than just being visual evidence that people are visiting this person. In Israel and in many other countries, not in the United States, the person is in a shroud, and I haven't been to funerals in Israel, I've been to funerals in Morocco, and this is what it looks like. The person is in a shroud, it's pretty clear there's a person there, and they are just laid to rest in the grave. This is the hands, the Kohanim hands. I think I mentioned kind of looking like that. Here is a simple casket. Here's someone tearing their garments. And here is someone, or here is a ribbon. Somebody asked, when was Kaddish composed? I would guess it's Talmudic, but I'm not certain about it. Certainly it's in Aramaic. So that would put it, definitely post-biblical. So the most intense period of mourning is called Shivah. Shivah is the Hebrew word for 7. So there's 7 days of intense mourning. And here's the story with Shivah. With Shivah, the mandated mourners, remember I gave you a list of the relatives who are obligated to mourn, are not supposed to leave the Shivah home for 7 days, except you don't mourn on Shabbat and you don't mourn on holidays. And in fact, the pilgrimage holidays interrupt Shivah. So if you had somebody die and 3 days later it is Sukkot, not only don't you mourn on Sukkot, but the Shivah period is ended. There is ritual impurity conveyed with being in a cemetery. So when you go home, many of you will recognize this, there will typically be a pitcher of water at the edge of the home. And you can, and it's traditional to wash your hands ritually and say the blessing, which ends in Al Natilat Yadayim. This is the same blessing that you would ritually wash your hands before any meal. There's a question, why do we wait a year to set the headstone? The idea of unveiling or setting a headstone is not the waiting time is not part of Jewish law. It's become traditional for 2 reasons. You'll see there's a 1-year period of mourning. So this is a nice way of ending that period. And then also in many climates, well, not only climates, typically earth settles. So if you've just dug a grave, put someone in the grave, tamp down the earth, that earth is going to settle. And if you erected a more traditional gravestone, chances are it would fall over if you did it before a year. So that's another reason there. There's a question, can you put do you need a coffin by Jewish law? You don't need a coffin according to Jewish law. You typically, actually, I'm not sure about a coffin in California law, but in most cases you need some kind of liner. But number one, so you don't have the problem of the earth settling, because one of the reasons the earth settles, whether it's a body or a coffin, over the course of the year, it's going to disintegrate. So you will have a collapse of the grave. In, I would say, every funeral I've conducted, there is some kind of typically concrete cement covering over the grave. Sometimes it really depends on the religious authorities at the cemetery. Sometimes there will be nothing underneath it. Sometimes there will be a bottom, but the bottom will have holes in it. And I once went to a Chabad funeral where there was nothing, there were no openings. And I asked the Chabad rabbi about it, and he said, according to at least Chabad tradition, cement is earth. It's made of the same things as earth, so they didn't require any opening. What I will see in less observant funerals is what I call a giant Tupperware, namely a plastic lining, which I personally find distasteful, but I'm not sure why. It just doesn't feel right to me. Let's see. Yes, so I believe that is California law. There is a movement now for more consistent funerals and ways of disposing of the body. So that's in process. But I would say in most places they do require some kind of I'm not even sure what to call it, but a concrete covering. So Shivah, the reason for 7, is the number of days that Joseph mourned for Jacob. It's also the number of days in the story of Job that Job's friends come and sit on the floor with him, and that becomes the tradition of sitting on the floor in silence after Job's children have died. It's halted by a holiday. The first 3 days are the most intense, and there are some traditions where people will observe Shivah for 3 days and not longer. And then the Zohar talks about the soul going to and from between the house and the grave, mourning for the body. So in mystical tradition, I see a lot of ideas that the soul is just disoriented and upset. There's a tradition in Morocco that I've never been able to find the origin of, but I saw it at funerals in Morocco, of putting the person's coat on the grave. And I asked my rabbinic teachers at HUC, and no one had ever even heard of it. Murray, if it's quick.
Yes. It sounds kind of scary to me if my soul goes to and fro between the house and the grave.
Well,
mourning.
and you, stop for a second. I understand that, but you also have expressed, fear of death. So I would say this
is afterlife, though, because you're saying my soul will be aware of the dead body.
Yes. So I would say that is a mystical teaching. Is it true?
For me, that's like Night of the Living Dead movies and stuff.
No, except they're not living. I guess the soul
is alive.
Yeah, the soul.
Right here.
Yes. So the soul never dies, and there's a period. So in the mystical understanding of this, there is a period of disorientation of the soul, and people praying for the departed in connection with Shivah is a way of comforting that soul. Let me move on. We're getting close to the end of this discussion. So there's a tradition of being uncomfortable, namely sitting on low stools or on the floor like Job. There is a tradition, and it's even part of Jewish law. I always thought this was just a tradition of covering mirrors, and for two reasons. One is just a rejection of your own personal vanity, that you're not checking how you look in the mirror. And the second, I think I would call it a superstitious belief that spirits from the next world are hovering in the mirrors. And so that's part of it. Traditionally, you don't shave or get a haircut. I think that's even for 30 days. You don't go out except on Shabbat, because you don't mourn on Shabbat. So a traditional man in Orthodoxy is obligated to pray in a minyan 3 times a day. So if he is not allowed to go out from his family, from his home, how does he go to the minyan? And the answer is the minyan comes to him. So in a traditional home, what you would have would be for 7 days or 6 days, because you wouldn't do it on Shabbat, is you would have an early morning service in the home for morning prayers. I guess morning prayers theoretically can take place up until noon, but people go to work. And then just before sunset, you would have afternoon prayers. And then just after sunset, you would have evening prayers. So it would be 3 prayer services a day. I would say in our world, it's much more typical that that right after the funeral, there is a meal of condolence, and that there's some kind of service associated with that meal. And I would say more traditional people will also have services. I can't think of in a reform setting anyone that I know that ever had 3 a day, but I do know conservative colleagues where they've had 3 services a day. And I actually think it's a good thing. This is my own personal opinion. If someone close to you have died, I think it's a good thing to take a week out of your life and just be with that. There is a tradition in Judaism that you don't greet the mourner or initiate conversation. That's actually awkward. You enter the room, you don't say, hi, how are you, how are you doing? The tradition is you enter the room, you sit down close to the mourner or next to the mourner, and you just sit quietly, and you're guided by what the mourner wants or needs. The mourner may be discussing, basketball or baseball. The mourner may not want to say anything. I once attended the most awful Shivah was for a young man. The parents were just absolutely devastated, and they made it clear that they did not want anyone to say a word at all, anytime. So the only words that were recited were by the rabbi leading the service. They did not want to have any discussion. So that's that tradition. The rule that I have been taught is always go or always call. There will be a tendency that you may tell yourself that the person probably doesn't want to talk to you, doesn't want to be bothered. The answer is that rule should never stop you, at least from calling. You can call and say, what's the best time to come? If the person doesn't want you to come, they will tell you, but don't ever, just assume that they don't want you to come. And again, my own suggestion is to observe Shivah for 7 days. So here's some images of people observing Shivah. There is a tradition of dairy meals and eggs as symbolic of life, and things that are round, again, symbolic of the circle of life. And then here is a pitcher, ritual cleansing pitcher called the Netilah. Again, the prayer ends with Netilat Yadayim, which literally means to lift up the hands. You're lifting them up in sanctity. And it has two handles, because you grab one handle and then you pour it over your left hand. But now if there was only one handle, that handle is not cleansed. So you grab the other handle with a clean hand and pour it over. That's why I think I have a Netilah behind me somewhere. So that's why a Netilah has two handles. Quite common on gravestones. Actually, here is my father's gravestone. It says, you see a pei and a nun, which says po niftar, here lies. You will often see this symbol, tet nun sadi bet hey, with, these are called chicks in Hebrew. They're I guess, apostrophes. And it's an indication that what you're seeing here is a word like NASA, an acronym. And it stands for the words, may his or her soul be bound up in the bond of life. And that phrase is taken from the Bible. You will often see, but not always, someone's Hebrew name. But again, it just varies a lot. So here's my father's Hebrew name, Chanan Bar Yaakov. Bar is the Aramaic word for son. That's why we have a bar mitzvah and not a ben mitzvah. So that is my
Rabbi,
father.
the information on these was helpful for me when I was searching my family tree to go backward in time.
Yes, yep. I get requests sometimes. It's actually kind of interesting for me to do, is someone will send me 30 or 40 pictures of gravestones and will, ask that I help them with the Hebrew names. And in fact, I discovered looking at my mother's gravestone that on my ordination certificate, I actually misspelled her Yiddish name, Kroisha. I asked my teacher how to spell Kroisha, and he was wrong, or the gravestone is wrong. I'm not sure which. So here's the Reichman's story, and I'm not going to read this, but I'll tell you the story so you can look along or just listen. So there's a story from a very wealthy family, billionaires in Canada, Orthodox Jews. And when old man Reichman died, he left an envelope for his sons, two envelopes actually, one to be immediately opened upon his passing, and the second one to be opened 30 days later. Actually, I seem to have skipped over this. I shouldn't have. Let me back up for a second, and actually let me take this off the screen. There is a 30-day period of mourning, which is less intense than Shivah, and it is observed by all the same people at Shivah. You basically, you're not supposed to shave. You're not supposed to sort of perfume yourself, get haircuts, and you don't go to celebrations or parties during that time. And then there is an 11th month period, I think I discussed this, called Shana. There's actually a 12-month period, which corresponds to the time that traditionally it's understood that the deceased is in Gehenna, which is sort of a purgatory where they're paying for the sins. And so traditional Jews will continue a lesser form of mourning in that whenever they're at a Jewish service, at the end of the service, actually several times in the service, a Kaddish is recited. And certainly at the end of every service, there is a Mourners Kaddish, and those people will rise. And so and they do it for 11 months. Why not a year? You don't want to make a public statement that mom or dad needed every last day in Gehenna to pay off all of their sins. but you can't be too careful. So the idea is everybody observes that period of 1 year or 11 months of actual mourning. So back to the Reichman story, old man Reichman left 2 notes, one to be opened immediately upon his passing, and the second to be opened after 30 days. And in the note to his sons, and remember he's Orthodox, and note to his sons, he requested that he be buried with a certain pair of socks. And he pointed out where they were. And so the sons dutifully took this pair of socks to the Mourners Kaddish, to the funeral, to the mortuary. And they, of course, informed him that it's against Jewish law to be buried in anything other than your burial shroud. It's also traditional for men to be buried with a talit with one of the fringes cut off. And the sons objected, and they went to a Beit Din, a rabbinic court, and of course, they said, sorry, this is Jewish law. And so after 30 days, they opened the second note. And in the second note, Reichman writes to his sons, by now you should have realized that although you can make billions of dollars in life, you can't take with you so much as a pair of socks, which story I really like. Let's see, I'm just looking at questions. I encountered a friend about a year after her husband's death. She had not reached out that time. She told me she had not reached out because she didn't know what to say. My response was, I don't understand. Suzanne, do you want to explain?
You were talking earlier about what you say when you, or you
Right.
shouldn't say anything. And so this was my response to that, because I said to her, the only thing you needed to say to me at any time was, I have no idea what to say to you.
Yes.
Because
and
everybody responds differently. And I
and-
think that's the best thing to say to anybody who's lost somebody.
Yes. And people will say a lot of stupid things, particularly with tragic deaths, like they're
Yes.
in a better place, or God needed them up there, or we needed one more angel in heaven, or basically these are all statements designed to make the person saying them feel more comfortable about what is a terrible tragedy. So one of my rabbinic friends would say, when somebody says something really stupid to you, look at their feet. And the question is, why should I look at their feet? He said, because they came and they're standing there. And that's the important thing to understand.
That's all that's important.
Okay, so here's the after Shivah. So Shloshim 30, yeah, go ahead, Murray.
Rabbi Mike, about Shivah, let's say, because I remember Rabbi Barbara mentioning this about 2 years ago, and I kind of was quizzical about, let's say it's the second day Shivah for my parent. I'm
Right.
sitting Shivah. And all right, now comes Passover, first night. I have to stop mourning and now celebrate Passover.
No. You stop observing the rules of mourning. What you do in your heart and soul is up to you. But you no longer wear the ribbon. You are free to leave the house. You don't have to leave the house. The minyan isn't going to come to you because you can go to the minyan. If you're really concerned about Jewish law, then you're obligated to go to the synagogue morning, afternoon, and evening to pray.
Does that go back to Aaron's 2 sons?
No, I don't think so. No. Okay. I don't know what the origin is, except the idea that holidays are inconsistent with mourning. So I talked about all of these. Yahrzeit is a Yiddish word, which is the anniversary of the date rather than the birthday. When my grandmother came here, she did not know her birthday. Birthdays are not a Jewish traditional thing. She had to pick one because when she came through Ellis Island, they asked her what her birthday was and wouldn't let her come in until she picked one. But it is traditional to remember someone on the anniversary of their passing. And as I mentioned, it's a matter of custom, not Jewish law. So I wanted to, again, in my reading, I came across another interesting thing about reincarnation. And again, there is this wonderful book, which I really recommend to you. It's in the reading list. It's called Does the Soul Survive by Rabbi Eli Spitz. Depending on how much time we have, I can read some of the stories in here that he writes about. But one of the interesting, this is interesting again to me. This is just from a standard Orthodox Siddur. And part of the bedtime Shema is to forgive other people before you go to bed. And the words are in there, whether in this transmigration or in another transmigration. In Hebrew, Bein Hagilgul, Zeh Vein Begilgul Achar. So, and it's a good translation. So here, the term Gilgul refers to the doctrine of Gilgul Neshamot, the transmigration of souls, one of the most mystical doctrines in Kabbalistic literature. In very simple terms, it refers to the reincarnation of certain souls for, now this is interesting, a second period of physical life on Earth. As I've reviewed this literature over the last few days, there's traditions about everything in reincarnation, some of which say you only have 3 transmigrations. Others say you can have as many as it takes for you to improve your soul and basically climb the ladder of holiness. Most Jewish traditions only speak about transmigration to other humans. And interestingly, there seems to be a gender. In most cases, the literature refers to men being reincarnated as men and women being reincarnated as women. And there are some mentions, but it's a minority opinion about whether you can be reincarnated as anything other than human.
Rabbi, isn't that a Kabbalistic term, Adam Kadmon?
Do you see Adam Kadmon somewhere?
It's you were talking about the ultimate improvement of oneself.
Adam Kadmon means the first Adam, the Adam in the Garden of Eden.
Okay, so
It may
something
tikkun
Kabbalah.
Tikkun hanefesh would be repairing your soul. We're more familiar with the word tikkun olam, but yeah. So there's a lot of stories here about the subject of near-death experiences and communication between worlds. So I think I mentioned a few of these. I don't know if it was last week or the week before. I'll mention a few that I didn't mention, and then you may want to share. So, well, this one is just kind of famous in my family. My younger brother lives in Miami, and some of you may know that, I don't know how many years ago it was, probably 25 years ago, there was this horrible hurricane, Hurricane Andrew, that tore Miami apart. And it occurred on my grandmother's yahrzeit. So before my brother left, he lit a yahrzeit candle, I think put it in the sink so as not to burn down the house. And when he came back the following day after the hurricane had blown through, there was no roof on the house, none. There was, I don't know, several inches of water throughout the house, but the candle was still burning. So that's kind of a fun story. Some of the other things that I've seen, and again, I remember some of you sharing, and I don't remember if I mentioned this, but I had a congregant in Ojai who had a near-death experience. And she described, and you see it in the literature, if you read the literature about near-death experiences, and if you just type near-death experience in on Google, you will find a lot of literature on the subject. And there's a lot of commonality about walking toward the light and being invited to keep going. And then, of course, anybody that comes back always had some sense of being drawn back or being told it's not yet your time. One of the really interesting and compelling stories about near-death experiences, and it's documented in Rabbi Spitz's book, somebody did a study of children who had near-death experiences. And again, they fit into this I would say paradigm of again going toward the light and things like that, but they talk about being greeted by people, and they are always greeted by people who have died before them. In some cases, may have only died minutes before them, like in a car crash, and never report being greeted by the person you'd expect if it was purely a psychological phenomenon, namely parents. And in children who have been very ill and kind of comatose, but not meeting the medical criteria of near death, there's no reports of this kind of phenomenon. The other thing which I'm very interested in are reports of things that can't be explained except through some phenomenon, let's say it just doesn't fit Western science. So and I have a lot of material on this, but one of the most interesting ones was a man who had gone through a near-death experience, and he reports on having a dialogue with an infant who was in the same hospital. And although the dialogue wasn't out loud, he could tell what the infant was thinking, and the infant was very unhappy and uncomfortable and crying, and the infant made him aware that the infant's arm was hurting severely. And after he awoke, he asked the doctors to check on this infant's arm, and it was broken. I don't know, maybe in birth process, I don't know why. But and then there's just story after story after story of people that, again, rise above their body, can report on what people are thinking, can report on what was going on in their family home, including what games the kids were playing, what clothing they were wearing. There's just report after report after report on this. And the only thing I can say is, as both a rabbi and a scientist, there's enough reports of this to make me think I don't understand it all. I think I mentioned, oh, here's one I'm sure I didn't mention. I was at a family home. Again, this is a family from my congregation in Camarillo. And they reported that as their uncle brother was dying, they had a baby monitor set up with a camera. And they saw a ball of light moving around the room. And they recorded it. They actually took I think a cell phone and recorded the image from the monitor. And so I saw this. I think I may have told you about a story of a woman who was taking this class with me in Camarillo and discussing it with her sister in New Jersey. And her sister had just lost her husband. And I think I mentioned this. For some bizarre reason, the husband put a doorbell on the back door, in the kitchen door of the house. No one ever rang this doorbell, because you don't ring a doorbell on the kitchen door. But while they were discussing this, the doorbell rang. And then later on during Shivah, this doorbell rang, and of course, nobody was there. I think I told you the story of Sonia having her dead aunt appear to her. And while she didn't say anything, it was clear to Sonia that the aunt was looking for a home for her soul. And Sonia was terrified by this, wrote a letter to her mother. Letter takes 2 weeks to get to Morocco. Meanwhile, that same night, Sonia reported what night the aunt appeared. The aunt appeared to Sonia's mother, it was her sister, saying, I have notes here on this, saying that I went to Sonia, but there was no room for me there. So then the family started looking for whoever might be pregnant in the family. And sure enough, there was an Israeli that was pregnant, and the woman was born. And although her name was Yael in Hebrew, everybody called her Anita, because that was the sister's name. And what was really funny is she never knew why until Sonia explained it to her. Sonia met her in Paris once. I think I mentioned when we were on our way to the cemetery to bury my stepson, to bury Sonia's son, actually to make arrangements to, as you can imagine, a time fraught with emotion. Sonia looked at her cell phone, and on the cell phone was her son, Mark, of blessed memory, his contact page with the question, delete contact, ? That was just there. I think I mentioned, I don't think I mentioned in this group, Sonia got very interested in this subject. She read this book, she's read other books. And finally, she got a little frustrated. And so we have cats. And the cats adore her. Every living thing adores Sonia, from me, the horses, the cats, to mosquitoes, and so on. So this cat routinely will sleep cuddled up next to Sonia or on top of her, but the cat never has touched her face. So at one point in time, Sonia said to the cat, okay, Mark, speaking to her son, if you're really out there and you're making contact with me, I want this cat to touch my face now. And the cat starts grooming its paw and touches her face. Let's see. I think I'll cut it off there. I can read more stories from the book, but let me finish what I have to say, and then if people want to share their own stories, we can do that. So this is kind of a bonus, and I'm actually thinking of teaching a class on this, and I can't decide whether it needs to be 7 sessions. There's a wonderful book by Rabbi David Wolpe called The 7 Questions You're Asked in Heaven. And from a few different rabbinic sources. There's a tradition that when we meet our maker, God will ask us 7 questions. And these are the questions. Did you deal honestly with people in your business practices? Did you busy yourself with procreation? Here, understanding that teachers are understood to be the spiritual parents of their students. Did you set aside time to study Torah? Did you hope for deliverance? This one, I think, is a focus of, were you optimistic? Did you seek wisdom? And did you understand one thing from another? My favorite one is number 6. Were there earthly pleasures permitted to you that you did not enjoy? Judaism never developed an ascetic, namely a denial, a lot of fasting, rejecting nice clothing, nice homes, and so on. And I love this understanding that God has made for us a world of wonder and beauty. And there are certain things, that we're not supposed to partake of. But of the stuff that's permitted, God, in effect, wants us to taste everything. And then, were you? Were you true to yourself? There's some books, and I think I have a list in the on the website. So here are my bottom lines about the afterlife and Jewish views of the afterlife. Many Jews believe many things about the afterlife. Not all of them are valid Jewish teachings. And again, I always focus on this. Judaism is obsessive about what we're supposed to do, really not so focused on what we're supposed to believe. But having said that, Judaism has always taught that there is something after this life. There's no dogma. There's no, you have to believe this, or you're not a good Jew. And that's not true of other religions. Certainly, there are many branches of Christianity which really focus on your having accepted the teaching of your particular church about the afterlife and many things. Some of the views are inconsistent. The idea of resurrection, of physical resurrection in the day of the coming of the Messiah, on many levels is inconsistent with reincarnation. For one thing, if you've gone through, a couple of dozen bodies, and now you're being resurrected in the day of the Messiah, which body does your soul go back to? And in some books, like Spitz's book, he absolutely states that the two are inconsistent, and he votes for reincarnation. I read another book by Neil Gilman, who's the preeminent thinker in the conservative movement, and he points to a mystical tradition that we have soul sparks. So our soul can, in effect, split into different parts, and different bodies will have different soul sparks. One of the things I didn't know until reading actually Rabbi Gilman's book, and for those of you, I know some of you are in conservative congregation, Reform has rejected the idea of physical resurrection, and we actually rejected it in our prayer book. So in the traditional end of the Givurot, the second prayer of the Amidah, in the Reform tradition, we say, Baruch atah Adonai mechaye hakol, which means blessed are you, Adonai, who gives life to everything. But the traditional ending of that prayer is mechaye hametim, who gives life to the dead. And actually, in our latest prayer book, you have the option of saying either one. What I didn't know was certainly in the early days of Reform Judaism rejected a lot of these sort of mystical you could say, superstitious ideas. What I didn't know was that was the one that sort of the straw that broke the camel's back. That's what created conservative Judaism. That within 2 years of the Pittsburgh Platform, which was a statement of this principle about rejecting resurrection, sorry, not reincarnation, that led to a group of rabbis beginning what became the conservative movement. I'm sure there were other issues as well, but that was a key issue. And I believe, go ahead. Yeah, Pixie.
I thought it was eating shrimp at graduation.
No, so there was a story, a very famous story called the Treifa banquet. At the first graduation of the Reform Seminary, which probably was maybe 8 or 9 years before this, the Rabbi Stephen Weiss really thought what he was creating was a unified American Jewish movement. So, for example, the name of the congregational organization was the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. The name of the rabbinic organization was the Central Conference of American Rabbis, and the name of the college was Hebrew Union College. And it turned out at the graduation, they served shrimp cocktail, and nobody knows whether this was a mistake or whether it was deliberate, but certainly all of the more traditional rabbis left at that point in time. I mean, there were no movements before Reform. Reform Judaism is the first movement, per se. And I'm sure that also spurred this idea, but at least Rabbi Gilman hit his point, and he is, I would say, the leading theologian of the conservative movement these days. He put it squarely on this idea of Reform rejecting resurrection. So my own belief is that there's powerful evidence that something is going on. I personally find this comforting. And as I love to say, one of my rabbis told me this, just because something is comforting doesn't mean it's wrong. It doesn't mean it's true, but it doesn't mean it's wrong. So I'm very much in line with this. I have a very strong sense of talking to my father, talking to my mother. There was this very powerful sense in my family, and in a minute I'll ask you about your families, that when someone passes on, Bubby is up there keeping an eye on us. That's why the Yahrzeit candle was burning through the worst hurricane in Florida history. And I talk to my parents, and I hear them, I often say on a non-mystical level, I talk to them, and because I know them so well, I hear them speaking to me. And another story in this book. It's a long story, but it was the rabbi burying a man who came from an Asian tradition, and was told that he loved butterflies. And at the funeral, when the rabbi was telling the story, there were just butterflies hovering. And then he made a mistake in the name he called the widow, because it was an Asian name, and he inverted the syllables and changed the syllables. And he realized it and apologized profusely. And afterward, the widow came to him in tears saying, "That was my husband's pet name for me." So there's just so many things going on here. Okay. So see you soon, right? In person, I hope. Online, if not. In Gan Eden or Olam Haba, the Garden of Eden, or the world to come, if we're into resurrection. And in a future Gilgal, if we're into reincarnation. But most of all, thanks for coming. Okay, so let me stop sharing and ask about those of you that might want to ask a question.
Thank you
or
for
tell a
doing
story.
it.
You are welcome. So actually, before people start running off, I'm going to send out a letter. I'm not going to be teaching in the next few weeks. I'm just taking a break. But I will send out a letter to my very large mailing list now, asking what you might be interested in future classes. And I have some suggestions, and you can tell me, yeah, I like 1, 4, and 5, or you may have ideas that haven't occurred to me. In fact, I'm sure you will. So that's my general plan. Barbara.
So I'm sorry to bring it up again, but it was not in your PowerPoint about cremation. Do we allow it?
Oh, okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And again, I apologize for not including it. So cremation is a fairly recent issue because cremation as a common form of disposal of a body has only been around, I would say in our culture for 150 years or so. Of course, you can go back to the Vikings who would put people on a ship. And I think in India, cremation is common. But in the Jewish world, it was originally ruled against, and the question was whether it constituted burial. So in the Torah, there's a specific mention of burying someone quickly. Actually, somebody asked something about this, and now I remember it. I think it's not in the Torah, I think in the Bible, about not leaving someone up more than a day before burial. So the original issue with cremation was whether it constituted burial. And then the next question is, does it constitute a prohibited form of mutilation of the body? The idea being, again, being consistent with resurrection, since God is going to resurrect the body, you want the decomposition to be as natural as possible. And then, of course, in the aftermath of the Holocaust, with the mass cremation of Jews, it takes on a special distaste. And of course, the rabbis rule that the Jews that were cremated by the Nazis certainly can be resurrected.
Rabbi, you mentioned though that even a regular body will disintegrate.
Yes,
is the word you used.
Yes.
After 1 year. So, cremation is just like a catalyzed higher rate kinetic process.
Yes, I absolutely agree with you. And when I'm counseling people, that's what I tell them two things. So a major issue for which I get a certain amount of flack from my Orthodox colleagues is I will officiate at funerals where there is a cremation. I know of Reform congregations that have cremation gardens on the site of their synagogue. So they'll have, an outdoor area and cremains will be buried there. So I tell them exactly what you said, Murray. Basically, what takes place over years, namely the oxidation of the hydrocarbons, leaving just behind basically bone and some minerals. And a cremation takes place in a few hours, but it's exactly the same process. And I also point out something that I find interesting is that certain families of Holocaust survivors have elected to be cremated as a way of solidarity with their family members who were cremated by Hitler. But cremation is absolutely not allowed under Jewish law. But in the Jewish
so when you're buried, you have a skeleton, but if you're cremated, there's no skeleton.
Well, because they grind the bones into.
So is that the offense possibly that?
No, I think the offense is just mutilation of the body by burning it. And then, of course, if you're not burying the cremains, if you're scattering it or leaving it on the mantle or putting it out to sea, that's not burial, according to Jewish law. Any other questions or stories you would like to share? I'm still recording, just to let you know.
But what about donating your body to science, and then when they're through with it, they usually cremate those remains?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say, again, I think in Jewish law, they would probably discourage donating your body to science. I think it might be permitted. I'm just going to mute everyone again. And hopefully not myself. I think it might be permitted if the science purpose is to improve human health. But then I would say if you're in the Orthodox world, you would want to treat the remains respectfully and not be cremated. So, and I don't know what, medical schools and others do. I just don't know.
Rabbi?
Yes, and then Shirley.
in talking about cremation, my father, my mother, my brother, my wife's father, and mother, they've all been cremated.
Right.
So for me, and I'm glad you said what you said, because for me, I want to be cremated because if it's a mistake or it's not the right thing to do, at least I want to be where my parents are and my brothers.
Right.
Does that make sense what I'm saying?
It makes sense. Is it consistent with Jewish law? No. But then, my stepson is cremated. So I have zero problem with cremation, except to explain Jewish legal issues as I explain Jewish legal issues, including shomer and the kind of casket. And one of the things that I find interesting is how obsessed I would say the ultra-Orthodox are with cremation. I've had cases where a family has had to threaten to sue a rabbi, to get a restraining order on a rabbi, to stop calling and harassing the family about the fact that they were planning to do a cremation. Shirley. Shirley, you have a hand up. I don't know if you're...
I was trying to unmute.
Okay.
You briefly mentioned Tahara, but then you didn't go into it. And this is something that I have done and will do again once the pandemic stuff is over. And I wanted to say that it fits in beautifully with your rule of honoring and respecting the deceased. I find it to be the most beautiful thing you can do to honor this person.
Yeah, so tahara is the ritual cleansing of a body, and certainly men cleanse men and women cleanse women. And people I know that have done it, there is a Jewish organization to encourage tahara, and not only in the ultra-Orthodox world, but in I would say the non-Orthodox world. And people that have done it describe it exactly in the terms you do. It's beautiful, it's respectful, it's honoring, and I don't have any personal experience with it.
Well, if anyone has even considered doing it and felt tentative, you do a little bit of training and then it's not difficult, and it's so rewarding.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. So Anna and then Tim.
Hi, I totally understand the Jewish law about cremation, but I mean, considering how long ago these laws were made up, I don't want to call it a pass, but isn't there any way to consider like it's actually better for the earth to cremate your remains than to bury them? I mean,
yeah, so there's actually some controversy about that. There's land use issues, which are pretty obvious. And then there's, I've heard both sides of it in terms of environmental issues, because the cremation, my sense of it is that it's 2, 3, 4 hours of basically high intensity gas flame. So that has environmental consequences. I don't think the consequences are, anything coming from the body, but so I would say certainly from a land use point of view, it seems more benign. But I don't know. There you just have to do.
I mean, we're just going to run out of places to bury people.
Oh yeah, and
That's
you.
the other thing to think about. I mean, what about like things where you can be cremated and buried in a pod that would grow a tree? I mean,
Yes, and that's what I'm saying is there are environmental options which are enjoying a lot of interest these days, and there's also financial issues, and some of the environmental options aren't so inexpensive, but it's not something I'm really up to date on. Yeah, I don't know what they do if you have a pacemaker. I think they probably remove it, but I'm not sure.
If you're being cremated.
I'm sorry?
They remove a pacemaker if you're being cremated.
Right. And then someone says you can destroy matter but not energy. Well, matter and energy can be converted into one another, typically through nuclear processes. And you equate the body to matter. I would certainly agree with that. And energy is the soul. As a physicist, I would quibble with that, but that's sort of my physics, not my rabbinics. Tim.
Okay, so the little story I have is I was sitting in a room. My brother-in-law, who I love dearly, was he was dying. And so we were all in the room because it seemed like it was getting close. And all of a sudden, the curtains kind of like flipped up, like there was a big breeze in there. And I got the distinct feeling that, you know what? I said, and I told everyone, I said, you know what? The angels are here for Steve.
Mhm.
And he died shortly thereafter.
Yeah.
And just one of the other little thoughts I had, we were reading something today, and I thought, if there's no afterlife, if we don't go somewhere, then we're basically God's ant farm, right? He created us just to kind of watch us.
Yeah. So the question is lack of an afterlife consistent with God at all? That's something
Yeah.
I think we could have some fun debating. You know, are we just toys for God to watch, or is there something about our soul? I would say most religious traditions have a soul concept. In fact, it was a beautiful statement. I think it was Rabbi Gilman, or maybe he was quoting somebody else. He said, oh no, he was talking about communities and religion. He said, religion springs from communities in the same way that apples spring from apple trees. That the two are as inevitable to one another. So it's slightly different. Somebody's asking about artificial knees and other body parts that they remove prior to cremation. I don't know. But if they are not, then, you know, my guess
They're
is
removed after by the crematorium.
okay. Yeah, so there would be just you know, burned metal parts,
Yes.
presumably. Yeah. So yeah. I don't know about the details of cremation. Okay. Anybody else have any burning things? Suzanne, are you waving or just saying goodbye? Okay. So thank you all. And I will be in touch.
Is that an intentional pun, Rabbi?
Okay, an unintentional pun?
No, was that an intentional pun that you made?
I have no idea what I said that might have been
Any
funny.
more burning things?
No, it was unintentional. wasn't funny enough to be one of my intentional puns. So
in other words, there's no class until we hear back from you.
correct. We still do have our Monday night program. And
Okay.
yes,
Monday night.
yeah. And
And
that
we
I'm
have
not.
Torah study Saturday.
And yeah, Torah study Saturday. And I'm going to stop.